So, is the recording on? There we go. So, good morning and welcome to this month's Game Shift pop-up. I'm Philippa Hardman. I'm one of the co-founders of Game Shift, and it's really lovely to see you all. We've still got some people joining. We've got about 40 signed up for today, and we know some people are coming and going. So, whoever's here are the right people to be here. So, I'm not going to say anything further. I'm just going to hand over to fellow Game Shift partner Andy Copeland, who's going to introduce Peter and say what intrigued him about setting all this up.
Thank you, Philippa. So welcome everyone to today's session. I'm very happy to introduce Dr. Peter Shepherd, who joins us this morning to share his insights on top team dynamics in a downturn. I first met Peter, I think over 15 years ago when we worked together at Ashridge Consulting. His journey has seen him work with the ICRC, the Red Cross, London Business School, and also time to do his doctorate. And I heard him talking about his research, and I found it fascinating. I'm supremely interested in how we as humans, as individuals, display different behaviors and work together under pressure. And that's exactly what Peter was talking about. So it really piqued my interest. Today's presentation draws on that ethnographic research from a leadership team in professional services, which show real world findings about how anxiety and unconscious defenses impact leadership behavior and business performance. And I'm very happy that we can play a part in sharing this work with the world. So Peter, over to you.
Well, thanks very much, Andy, and good morning, everyone, or good evening, depending on where you are. Thanks very much for showing an interest in the things that I'm interested in too. I think at this point I'll go straight to sharing my slides, and just to say, I've got some slides. I'm going to present the research through the medium of slides, and then we'll stop and talk about it once I've finished. So, plan is to talk for probably about 30 minutes, and then crack on afterwards. Over to the slides and share.
And Peter, just while you're putting your slides up, if people have got questions in the meantime, I think we'll invite them to go into the chat as well as waiting till the end. And
yeah, good idea. I mean, Andy offered to sort of like mediate, so or moderate, I should say. Let me know when people have got their hand up if I'm not noticing, or that they've got a question in the chat.
Absolutely. So any questions, put them in the chat and I'll make sure Peter hears them.
Yeah, I really don't like the idea that somebody would be just stuck with, wait a minute, I just didn't quite grasp that, and we didn't pay attention to it. So look, as Andy says, I'm Peter Shepherd. I'm a former colleague of Philippa, Chris, Andy from Ashridge Consulting about 15 years ago. Something like that. I now work independently, so I work for myself. I've had a lifelong interest in group dynamics and particularly how groups behave under pressure, and more recently, how groups defend against anxiety, even if it means acting against their own best interests, so or immorally. It's just sort of super fascinating to me. So I did a study. So I studied at the Tavistock Clinic. I did my doctorate at the Tavistock Clinic from 2017 to 2024, and did my field work from 2018 to 2019 in a professional services company. So it was a management consulting firm. So the way it came about was I was doing some freelance work for London Business School, and one of the clients that I did a lot of work with was a management consultancy, and I just became really interested in them. They presented as kind of super good learners and super polite and well behaved, and I just sort of thought, I wonder what they're like back in their own context. I'm sure they're as professional and as courteous and what have you, but I wonder what it's like on the ground with them. So I got permission to study them, and I'd long been interested in the idea of doing an organizational ethnography, so being on the ground with people for a prolonged period, and so that's what I elected to do. So Now, how do I move my slides forward here, Andy? Oh, there you go. So this is the only slide about theory, and the rest of it is just practical. But I did want to say the ideas, if you like, that say something about the ideas that inform the study. So the Tavistock way of running a doctorate is pretty informed by systems thinking and psychoanalysis anyway, and the anthropology was my choice of method. From systems thinking, really, the only thing that I really want to point out is my fascination with the idea that wholes and parts behave differently, that they have different properties. So, smart people might make a dumb team, or, a compassionate group of leaders might take cruel decisions without intending to. So, wholes and parts is part of my thinking about that. Then from psychoanalysis, well, the emphasis on what is permitted to enter our consciousness and what is prevented by means outside of our awareness. And then just from anthropology, the idea that by studying people for a long period, you can discern patterns in their behavior, whether those are patterns that they're consciously aware of or patterns that are unconscious. So together I put all these things into a research proposal to study the influence of the unconscious on team dynamics. And as I say, it was a global consulting firm, and I was treated like a temporary member of the organization, kind of like a guest. Not really a member, more like a guest, like an honored guest. And I was called academic in residence, which yeah, it wasn't always comfortable for me, but that was comfortable for them, and so on. So my practice was really to observe and make notes about what I sort of saw in the outer world, but also make notes about my internal world and my experience of being in their world. So field notes and journals were my main sources of data, but I also interviewed 10 of the 16 partners in the firm. And then took all that data away, that massive data away, because it was a lot. And during COVID, actually, was able to spend probably more time had COVID not happened, analyzing the data and cross-checking it. I used thematic analysis and Foucauldian discourse analysis to triangulate the data and produce my interpretation of the findings, which I tested on some people who had worked at the firm to try and keep me, bless you, Antoinette, to try and keep me honest and produce my thesis. So that was the process. But at the time in the firm, well, in UK society, there was quite a lot going on. So we were 2 years on from Brexit. And for this particular firm, that had a really significant impact. Not only were some members of staff reporting that they had been catcalled in the street or shouted at to speak English, but also that whereas London for this particular consulting firm was a desirable destination for young people at the beginning of their careers to come and have a London experience, maybe stay in London, maybe not. Restrictions on travel and work permits and visas cast a lot of uncertainty into the mix. So that was one thing. Then the Me Too movement was carrying with it a resistance, totally justified resistance to dehumanizing practices in the workplace. It felt at the time in that firm, very specifically, it felt like it could be a watershed moment, whether it proved to be or not, discuss. But just being aware that people were attentive to structural inequalities, discrimination, sexual harassment, and so on, was different for this firm. I could tell it was different when I was there. And then the third thing was, there was an economic downturn, and actually, this really informed my research, because I had been planning to stay for about 6 to 9 months, and then 2018 ended as a good year, but there was just this sort of like warning on the horizon that actually 2019, particularly the first 2 quarters, might be quite soft. And for partners in a consulting firm, if their pipeline is looking a bit empty, or they're not so secure, then that can be quite threatening. So I thought, wow, this is the inflection point, actually. Not only am I studying group dynamics, but I'm also studying the period of transition between a period of felt abundance to a period of felt scarcity. So, what did I actually learn about the profession? I didn't realize, but actually, big strategy consulting firms are really, I think, or at least this one, owed quite a lot to its engineering lineage and the sort of almost like time and motion studies and quite a sort of positivist approach. So they tended to see their primary task as problem solving. And the reason for my arrows here are sort of like the arrow on the right is, rather on the left is a problem. Then there's a process of sort of data collection and analysis, and then there's a solution pops out the other side. But for me, given my interest, there's also a psychological process going on. So there is, client presents with some degree of anxiety. Consulting firm offers containment of that anxiety to restore the thinking function. And what pops out is calm. So it's like the consultants are containing the anxiety. It's a kind of conversion process, whether it's problem to solution, anxiety to calm. There's a kind of process of conversion. But it means in practice that the containment that consultants offer is a commodity. They sell it. It's part of the deal. That's what clients expect. And that the corollary of that is to say that consultants engage in emotional labor as well as intellectual labor. So they have to sort of use their emotions in their work or absorb other people's emotions for commercial benefit. And of course, for partners in very high-profile roles and charging high fees, making extravagant claims, the pressure is considerable. Not only to do the work, but also to find the work and do it. So they're heavily targeted and so on. I mean, financially targeted, but also they are the targets of other people's projections, and they can take on the status of heroes when work is going well, or they've won a big bit of work for the firm, and villains if the client or the junior team is looking for somewhere to dump their anxiety, then pretty much the partners are the number one choice. So I came to realize that the template for the ideal partner, not only is it quite heavily gendered, but it also tends to conceal what's at odds with the image of somebody who's impressive and in control and in command. It's like the doubt, the uncertainty, the fear has to be hidden in order for them to function. Even to the extent that actually the firm I was working in had sort of physically had a front of house where we met clients, and then a kind of backstage where we did, the slide factory, as they used to call it.
Peter, we've got a question
Yeah.
actually about the previous slide about the context of uncertainty. Liz is asking, she would be curious to hear about how COVID influenced your findings, as it sounds like you were with them beforehand.
Yeah, I was with them beforehand and left just as COVID was becoming a thing. But I did sort of hear so it didn't really affect my findings in a pure sense, but I did hear how they had gone on afterwards. And there's a later slide where I can talk to that.
Brilliant, thank you.
My pleasure. Even though you didn't actually say thank you. Anyway, thank you. It's my pleasure. What did I learn? Well, I learned that consulting work is highly charged, and that people are exposed to considerable anxiety. And I had sort of assumed that partners would be, their emotions would be linked to market conditions, in the sense that, I'm doing well, I'm feeling happy, I'm doing not so well, I'm feeling sad, or, worried or whatever. But it wasn't quite that straightforward. I mean, in a way, because the people in the roles I was paying most attention to were responsible for business development, yes, there was, joy and elation when things well, and fear and disappointment when they didn't. But nonetheless, I suppose the bigger finding was that they're always rather always anxious. And what are they anxious about? Well, put simply, if you win too much work, your fear of being overwhelmed by it. And if you win too little, your fear of being sort of abandoned. And those are quite primitive human fears. So there's no real stable position in this. It's in a sort of permanent flux. And security, which people seek, is somewhat unattainable. And you do hear people talk about management consultants as sort of oscillating between being omnipotent and impotent, without much ground in the middle. And one of the things that struck me was that humans are largely adapted for episodic stress, but not for chronic stress. And we know now, don't we, that actually chronic stress, is sort of, within our bodies, is has an impact on our health and well-being. And my experience of partners was that they tended not to voice anxiety in public fora, but when they spoke to me in private, they spoke to fairly, basic or primitive existential fears. Am I safe here? Am I wanted? Am I good enough? Do I belong? And that was common. It was more common than I had expected. So if you scale up from the individual level to the group level, then what I observed was defenses in place. So the system had evolved to be defensive in nature. That in order not to be flooded by anxiety, it had adapted social defenses in response to perceived threat, perceived danger. By social, I mean the defenses are maintained through tacit social processes and are understood at an unconscious level to be a feature of the environment. A feature of the environment. I've organized these in a list which probably doesn't do justice to the sort of complexity and interplay between them, but things that you'll recognize: these fight defenses, attempts to overcome sources of anxiety; flight defenses, attempts to escape from sources of anxiety; and freeze defenses, attempts to deny the reality of the anxiety via paralysis or inertia. And that not only are these behavioral in nature, but that they actually, over time, they inform the design of structures that we inhabit, the processes we follow. So they become, if you like, defensiveness is a covert organizing principle. So there's the primary task, we're here to problem solve, but sort of in the background, if you like, we're here to defend ourselves against anxiety. And the defenses, you can see they have a functional aspect. You can see why people adopt these defenses. And this is not an exhaustive list, by the way. But they're self-defeating in the long term. So they're rational in the short term, but irrational. But they become normalized in the culture. That's the point I'm really trying to make. So as I thought about this, I became interested in how the transition had worked from abundance to scarcity. And I thought about the pressure that partners are under, not only their ambitions and expectations of themselves, but the targets that they were working to, the kind of up or out culture of performance management. And I observed that or at least I interpreted from the data, that the systems under this pressure behaved as if it was under attack. And therefore defends itself, adopts these social defenses that I talked about on the last slide, that offer temporary relief, but actually heighten anxiety more than they offer protection, because they emphasize fragility and they're defending against insecurity and they're divisive. So the partner group that I studied was always sort of a little uneasy. Social relations were cordial and courteous, but not necessarily deep bonds of affection throughout. But as the pressure built and rumors of a cull and what have you, people atomize and go into a kind of survival mindset where they're making fearful comparisons between themselves and their colleagues. Am I safe? Is she safe? Am I doing enough? And because there's not much information in the mix, the assumption is somewhat paranoid that, Philippa's probably doing better than me, so I better raise my game. So, and so on and so forth. So you get this kind of escalation, I suppose, this runaway escalation of overworking, and a kind of panic. I often had the image of musical chairs from childhood, people making sure that when the music stops, that they've got a seat. And this is not just individual stress, of course. This is a sort of crisis of containment that affects the group as a whole. So if I move my attention now away from the partners and think about the other people who I encountered, particularly the juniors in the firm, um, and the management services staff, the question for me was, if the top team confronts this anxiety, then that's potentially containing. But if the top team is reluctant or unable or unskilled in confronting or turning into what they find most difficult, then that has consequences for everybody else. Where does the anxiety actually go? Who absorbs it? Well, you know, when pressure was really on, the juniors tended to feel abandoned and overworked. There was the partners were engaged in battles for resources, which meant some quite political behaviours. The juniors had to work long hours, heavy workloads, and when they expressed distress, the system couldn't seem somehow to hear it. So their feeling was that it went unheard, and really a sort of exchange of projections between the generations. So you've got junior people looking up into the system thinking, I'm not sure I want to be a partner if that's how partners behave or if that's what's obliged, what they're obliged to do. And the partners, perhaps some partners anyway, looking down into the junior cadre and saying, well, it was tough for us and it should be tough for them too. That's just consulting. It's probably be better if we weed out those who aren't going to make it straight away. Well, whatever you think about that, one of the things that I felt challenged by was their idea of who makes it, because they were assuming a meritocracy, but what I actually saw was something different, was people, some people with more chance of quote unquote making it than others. So men had more chance of making it than women in this context, for example. So that was known at the junior level. So you get this sense of injustice that mostly is suppressed, and not least because people want to, however aggrieved they might feel, they also want to curry favor with partners because the partners hold their career prospects in their hands. But sometimes a sense of injustice and a mood that was a form of protest, a kind of communication to the leadership team that not everything was always satisfactory. So, in purely commercial terms, I felt that this way of going on, if you like, this way of being defensive in an unaddressed way, represented a limit to growth, but it was self-imposed. So. Leaders tended not to identify as leaders, and they tended not to act in a coherent way. So instead of a downturn being a shared problem for 16 people, it tended to be 16 problems that individuals were going to, kind of crack on their own. And I mean, I'm sure many of you know consulting and, and professional services, and leadership can be very contested, can be very contingent anyway. So authority is not given, it sort of comes and goes. So leadership is difficult enough at the best of times, but leadership in a downturn, extremely difficult. And of course, I think what happens then is that people then don't take to market the confidence that they would like to. There's this sort of feeling of inferiority compared to the competitors. If we were only like XYZ and so on. And then what can juniors do? Well, they can start to withdraw discretionary effort because the whole system runs on discretionary effort. And actually, if their needs aren't being met and they try and express that and that's not being heard, then gradually they will withdraw discretionary effort. And the system, I wouldn't say it grinds to a halt by any manner of means, but it affects productivity, affects performance. And then key personnel start to think, well, looking into this system, I'm not sure I see a future for me. Or at least looking into this system and the way it functions, and I'm not sure this is good for me. I'm not sure I want to stay. So, and it's typically the people who you've worked hardest to, promote into management and senior roles who are the first to go, first to feel that actually they are bearing a disproportionate amount of the pressure. They're acting as kind of shock shock absorbers. But all this leaves you thinking. I mean, don't get me wrong. This is a super successful firm. It didn't stop being successful. I'm not describing a disaster here. I'm describing a suboptimal situation. But it made me think, like, what is this course of action preferable to? Why is this happening? And I noticed that. Oh, we often don't we use this iceberg metaphor. So there's above the waterline, there's what's known and said. Then there's stuff that's known and not said. In the realm of taboo. And I went to lots of meetings. I mean, lots and lots of meetings that I was observing where there was a lot known and not said. And people would self-censor. Then there's the kind of blind spots, just what we don't know and what we don't say. But there's something for me deeper about what is within this sort of paradigm or this way of being that is the firm's culture. What we can't possibly know, you can't possibly say because you can't possibly know that. In the sense that the discourse doesn't allow that kind of knowledge to surface. And you question what's being defended against. Is the firm actually ambivalent about its duty of care? Is there a sort of fear about the obsolescence of the business operating model that's not being addressed? What's going on? I mean, I didn't try to answer those questions because they're not findings types of questions. They are questions that hang in the air, as it were. But what I did notice, and this is to the point about COVID that was asked earlier on, what I did notice was that it didn't take much for the cycle that I described earlier to reverse. So there was one or two particular situations where some of the women managers sort of got a protest about their treatment as far as the partnership team and as far as the agenda for the partnership team. And as the group had gone on, there were more women in the group, there were more younger people in the group, there was more diversity and more willingness to challenge. And actually, around that topic, the group started to own some of its underperformance, whereas in the past it would have been dismissed and brushed off and what have you. They kind of owned it and started to inquire. So it gave me the sense, and then I saw this on a few occasions, it gave me the sense that actually, where a leadership group can inquire into itself and how it functions and develop a comfort, a familiarity and comfort for working through difficult stuff rather than being avoidant, that actually the group forms a much more realistic image of itself. So it's not that sort of omnipotent, impotent seesaw that I was describing earlier, but rather something a bit more realistic, which tends to mean that people feel more invested in the group. There's less need to self-censor. There's less need to sort of feel shameful if you speak, but rather there's more spontaneity and more risk taking. And I think that what happens is the group then forms an image of itself that is more open and more able to tolerate its quote good and bad dimensions rather than being only good and splitting off the bad and denying that. So
There's been a statement more than the question from Karen, and it chimes with my experience as well. She says, I'm loving the irony of consultancy supporting client anxiety and not always having the awareness or capability to deal with their own organizational anxiety.
well, I think that's a great observation, and it sort of it begs the question. Well, what is happening? Why is that? Is it as straightforward as we just conceal what's backstage, or is there something else going on? Maybe this is maybe. So I talk about this. Oh, my slides are going all over the show. Hang on. I'm trying to get to this one. Right. Okay. Stay stable. Maybe have a read of this. So I think, one of the things that's happening is that it's all very well saying to people on the run, you should be more reflective, or let's take some time in partner meeting agendas to just make sense, or whatever. But it's also super super difficult. They're literally, they're fugitives. They're kind of in flight, and reflective practice is really difficult. So it's avoided. So there is this kind of hatred, as Bion calls it, this hatred of learning from experience.
Sarah has asked, do we always need someone else's help to help us see ourselves?
Well, that's my next doctorate. I don't know. What does Sarah think?
Hi. I was just reacting to the irony of helping people go see, clients see the anxiety and not seeing our own. I think therapists go in therapy, and I feel it's a natural. Carers need care. I think it's a natural process that we see what is in others better than what we see in ourselves, and therefore we always need an external companion to
Yeah.
see ourselves.
Well, I
I'm
kind
kind
of
of a
hope so.
coach, so this is what coaching is about.
Yeah, yeah. But I'm so invested in the answer being yes, that I don't think I can extricate myself from that enough to think. Oh, well, you know, I think there's sort of stimulus and catalyzing of that change, and then I think groups can take over some of that and work with some of that. I think it's probably a bit of both. I'm not really sure.
I like the catalyst aspect.
Pardon? Sorry.
I like the catalyst aspect.
Yeah, well, that's what coaches and consultants can be, isn't it? Look, this is the last slide, and then I'm gonna open it up to discussion. But I suppose I went into the study thinking that anxiety was kind of like an output, that people do stuff that makes them anxious, and then that's an outcome or an output of the process. But actually, the more I went into it, the more I began to believe that actually anxiety is both, some manifestations of anxiety are undesirable, and yet this system is set up, that I was observing, is set up to make anxiety necessary as well. It's necessary to its functioning. So I think what I saw was anxiety in the system, a kind of a crisis of containment, juniors using, well, I think I discovered that organizational mood is a form of communication. And you could argue that leadership has a moral responsibility to process uncertainty and paradox and contradiction. Otherwise, it gets processed elsewhere with people who don't have the resources or the positional power to do things with it. So power in this context is the power to determine where in the system that the anxiety gets felt. Is it at the front line? Is it at the top table? Is it where is it? And I think particularly in professional services and particularly the firm I observed, power, well, power didn't necessarily need it to be exercised in an oppressive way over people, because they had internalized a lot of the discipline themselves, and sort of, people wanted to be resilient, people wanted to be ambitious, people want, they had quite a lot of this had been internalized. So it wasn't like anybody needed to come along with a big stick and say, do this, do that. They wanted to shine, they wanted to stand out, they wanted to aspire to excellence, and so on. I notice in recent years, well, I do some work in law firms, and there's a big, a discourse has opened up, or rather, a space has opened up in the discourse to talk a lot about well-being, workplace well-being, mental health well-being, and so on. But I become a bit concerned sometimes that actually, as soon as a space like that opens up, it can be colonized and commodified, and that actually psychology becomes, organizational psychology can become a form of oppression, really, or a sort of discipline or a technology of power, which makes me a bit uncomfortable. I mean, we can talk later about the evolution of OD. I don't think I need to go into that right now. But I think what I come away from all of this with is that it's difficult to talk to people, nor would I necessarily want to talk to people about anxiety purely on moral grounds alone or health grounds alone, but rather, I think it's important to keep in the mix that actually, for commercial companies, it's like your top team dynamic could be a source of differentiation and advantage. Great. And it could be an inhibitor, a limit to growth, as I called it before. And it's up to you. If you want to leave money on the table, that's your call. But attention to it is important. But attention to it requires, in my view, and here I'll stop. So, well, if a firm it seems stuck in some self-sabotaging patterns, and those patterns have consequences for leadership, for morale, for collective confidence, for business performance, then what I speculate is that the the way the organization functions inhibits critical thinking, and I think that that's leadership is creating spaces for critical thinking and making critical thinking safe. Because if an organization can convert experience into insight, insight into adaptation, adaptation into advantage, then in a sort of safe way, then that's potentially a good thing. But if critical thinking feels too dangerous and organizational learning feels too risky, then the organization is condemned to stay as it is in an environment that's changing, and adaptation is therefore impossible. So look, that's my that's my
Before we come
slide.
off the slides, Peter,
Yeah.
Liz has asked if you can go back to the cycle and just speak to the last bit a little more. She said she'd like to hear more about how confidence grew, how collective leadership was internalized, and particularly with partners, and what helped.
Okay, yeah, sure. So if I take the example of the discussion around women managers in the firm, I think that what helped was there were more women around the table. Not that necessarily women should be advocates for women. I'm not at all saying that, but those women who were around the table were uh, direct about the group's tendency to accelerate past this issue in the past, and that they found that intolerable and that they would want the group to stop and pay attention to it. But what I think helped also was the fact that the group then that gave permission for other people, uh, all the people in the room to share their feelings about it, so that some had feelings of ambivalence, some had feelings of resistance, some had feelings of advocacy and support. But it just meant that uh, owning and giving voice to the emotions in the room was safe. It felt safer if some people set an example. And then the group, as I say, develops this image of itself as I think previous to that, it would have been the self-talk. I don't know. Well, the unconscious assumption within the group would have been, this is a dangerous group. Do not put your head above the parapet. Do not say controversial things. Wait. If somebody else is a blowhard, that's really good because it means that they're using up a lot of the airtime. So just stay under the radar, conform, belong. You owe you're not going to get patronage or sponsorship from X or Y if you disagree with them in public. So just stay safe. Whereas I think around this discussion and discussions that follow is that actually it's not safe to just you don't feel safe when you're staying under the radar. You may not be taking overt threats, overt risks, but you're not feeling safe. Whereas when people are able to bring more of themselves into the mix, senior people are setting that example. It's my belief that the group then internalizes the idea we are a group who can work through difficulty. We are a group in which it's safe to say controversial things. Now, it's not a forever like magic dust. Obviously, there's that pull to mature and keep maturing in one direction, but that coexists with a much more regressive pull where people want to go back to feelings of safety and security, perhaps, and if they feel safer being discriminatory or bigoted, then that's where they might default to. But yeah, that was my experience of that.
Thank you, Peter.
It's a pleasure.
Yes, so on the discussion, we've got a couple of questions bubbling up from Edward and from Sibyl. I was wondering if you'd like to have a dialogue rather than responding to me reading out questions. So I would invite those of you who have typed up questions that haven't been addressed, if you would like to ask them directly to Peter.
Yeah, and Andy, do you think it should be just to me, or do you think it should be just like anybody who's got an answer or an idea should answer or give their idea?
Yeah,
Otherwise, it's a bit sort of like one way, right?
absolutely.
Peter, I've got a question for you on this. I've been doing some reading recently about the kind of concept of keystone habits and keystone behaviors, where if you do one thing well, it can have a positive ripple effect on other things, like how, for example, in our daily lives, if you take good exercise, it might then help your sleep and etc. And I'm wondering whether, in your observations, in particular of this company, you had any thoughts about, if they were going to get really good at one particular practice, for example, holding space well for uncomfortable conversations, is there a sort of almost a keystone behavior? Does that make sense as a question?
It makes perfect sense as a question, yeah. To me, anyway. I mean, I'll give my answer, and then other people will too. But I think for this particular firm, it would be. I think that doing their politics in the open would be my answer, because there's so much data in that, because it's so emotive, because it's so charged, because if they are able, if a group is able to just sort of catch a reaction and go, whoa, 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 wait a minute, stop, because that clearly matters a lot to us, so let's dig into that. So I think that the poor habit would be to, whoa, rush past it, that was a bit uncomfortable, wasn't it? Jeeps, orcs, let's carry on doing something else. And the habit, I think, would be to turn in at that moment and if necessary, jettison the agenda, which in the case of the film that I was studying was often information. It was just information where you can read slides by email. You don't have to be sitting in a room. That would be my answer.
Edward, do you want to say a little bit about the question you had put in the chat?
Yeah, sure. So I was curious in terms of, what you'd noticed about this self-defeating tailspin of kind of anxiety doing the loop, and it wasn't a problem shared across the team. It was, it was dispersed and driven underground, so that everyone was kind of competing for themselves. And I was curious in terms of if there was a shift or a tipping point or whatever the process was that enabled essentially the group to wake up to being more open to reflective practice, to noticing some of the patterns that were happening.
Thanks, Edward. I mean, I think that as the group became more diverse and heterogeneous, then that was probably the biggest single factor. There were, over the time that I was there, they went from having one woman partner to several women partners. They went from having a sort of a particular age threshold to having much more a mix of junior and senior people. I mean, as the group got bigger, it became a bit unwieldy at times. But I think that what helped was diversity and inclusion, and I know that's a massive topic, but I think what was not helping was exclusion, really, and some anxious men not really knowing what to do with their anxiety.
Can I just offer a reflection on that as well, which kind of Gabor Mate kind of talks in terms of development and maturation at an individual level, the kind of distinction between attachment and authenticity. So when you're vulnerable, when you are dependent on others for care, support, nurturing, that attachment wins out because it's really important to get that affirmation and support from the people you depend on. As you become more self-reliant, when you kind of get more how you work, then it shifts more into authenticity. And so that can come to the fore. And some of the things that you're talking about is like the attachment, unhealthy as it is in terms of it's important to feel safe. And therefore I will kind of subvert my drive for authenticity and saying my truth or how I see things. That gets squashed so that I kind of continue to feel safe. And kind of your reflection in terms of increasing group diversity, I wonder, is because actually the kind of authenticity became more either acceptable or it was more unpalatable to not be authentic in favor of the attachment to group norms. Just curious about that. I don't know.
I think that's a good observation. That's consistent with what I observed, I think. Yeah. Thanks, Edward.
Chris has his hand up.
Hello, Peter. I thought that was brilliant. Thank you. I love it. I just wanted to pick up on something that Karen Wills said, which I thought was about the irony of consulting and anxiety. The word that's come to me during this, I never thought about it before. It's an engineering term about corrosion in pipelines, where you often put in something called a sacrificial anode, which is to stop the other metal corroding as quickly. You put in a bit of metal that corrodes quicker. And I looked it up as you were speaking, and it says, because they are corroded, they need to be replaced periodically. And there's something in the relationship between consultants and clients that has an element of sacrificial anode for the anxiety in a system. The consultant gets consumed and spat out. You know, that's just part of what we accept in consulting. We will be consumed and spat out. And there's also something, I think, in consultancies. You know, I've seen this time and time again in everything from Pricewaterhouse to other smaller, supposedly human-centric consultancies, the element of consultants being sacrificed to something. I just had I don't have anything to say other than, I have no clever point to make other than that came to me. And I think there's something in it.
I really agree, Chris. I think there's a whole kind of like interesting strand about, you know, the idea that something gets located in people to the point where they're actually no longer bearable to the system, or the system has to sort of expunge, you know. So my experience was of being sort of like, I joined, you know, I was sort of quite flattered and I was made into an ideal object, this kind of benign academic come to study us. That's kind of interesting. And then I was neutralized, kind of disarmed. Yeah, he's bringing some dangerous stuff, so we don't want any of that crap. And then I was put to use in service of the system. And then eventually I felt that I had to go, that actually the system couldn't bear to have me around anymore.
And there's an effect on the individual consultant having been a sacrificial anode for
dead right
months and years, especially if you don't know that you are.
Yeah, dead right. Witness our conversation about heart conditions, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Right.
There was another question in the chat from Sabila. Do you want to share?
Yeah, so thank you so much. I really loved what you said, and I also loved how you said it, and I loved how you showed it in your slides. So thank you very much. I was thinking about helpful and unhelpful structures and how they come about either in a self-organizing way or being imposed. And if you had encountered any kind of organically grown support structures that people offered. I was sort of thinking of 20 years ago when I was working in consulting, we had this Sunday lunchtime crew that rocked up in the office, all of us with a kind of a big cup of coffee. And not that we would ever admit to anybody else that we spent the whole of Sunday crunching through slides, but we sort of had our own support in our secret encounters at the time. And it was very kind of bizarrely helpful. Yeah, I'm also thinking of unhelpful structures and practices. Like I've been in meetings where suddenly everybody calls each other by surname because they all went to the same school and that was what they did at the time. And you kind of suddenly think there is another dialogue going on that I'm not part of. So if you could just say something about self-organizing structures that are helpful or not, and if we could adopt them into formalized helpful structures.
Well, okay, I'll make a couple of observations from the data. I think you see, one of the limitations of the study is I wasn't on client side, so I wasn't able to see consultants do most of their consulting. You know, whether that was in a sort of like war room typing away at Excel, or you know, talking to the client or whatever. I was aware that the system used to kind of ventilate either on team dinners or, as you say, you know, crunching slides late into the night, but just kind of like laughing at the partner's absurd behavior or whatever. Now, it was interesting that the teams that really, you know, teams really appreciated when a partner would come and roll their sleeves up, you know, in the early evening, late evening, or whatever, and do the slides as well. That was sort of, you know, not exactly heroic because that sounds a bit two-dimensional. That was, you know, they appreciated that behavior, and it was noteworthy when partners, you know, didn't use that or behaved in very sort of transactional ways. I think I also, you know, rightly or wrongly, but as an anthropologist, I went on a ski trip with them. They did some charity work and I did that. And I noticed that actually, you know, these periodic kind of rehumanizing activities where people did get to see, you know, each other in a more rounded way, beyond their position or beyond the task was necessary to the system. The other thing I did was go to partner conferences, and there's you know, there's a great deal of collegiality between the partners. Sometimes that can act as a sort of mask for unspoken aggression, but I think on the other hand, there is a great deal of affection and interest in other partners from partners. So those are a few observations, Sabine. I don't know if they speak to your point. What do you think?
Yeah, I feel like I'm working with a school, with a secondary school, and we are a group of people who are revitalizing the community. And how we work together, we have a lot of informal ways to support each other. We go to music gigs, invite each other for breakfast and so on. So we spend a bit of time experimenting what works for you that gives us energy. And it was really helpful to allow ourselves to do that, and be appreciative of that. So I'm just wondering to what extent other organizations have that sort of freedom to play around with what works. Like, oh, maybe that meeting is a bit heavy. If we all come 10 minutes earlier and do that, maybe that would help us to make a good start.
Yeah, I agree. Anything that is humanizing, I kind of think, because I think when people are afraid or anxious, they dehumanize. You know, that's the tendency that I observed.
There's a question in the chat from Jane. I'm just going to leave her a bit of space if she would like to ask that.
Oh, thanks very much. Peter, brilliant session. And it just so resonated with my experience. Some of my scars as well from consulting as well. I can see lots of nods and kind of agreement from those of us who've been in the field and are still there. So I'm just really curious because what you say is so clear and insightful and resonates. How and you talked about your life cycle within the organization as part of your research, but this has application and far wider insight more generally, not just in consulting but in other services that you can see the transference. I'm just curious to kind of understand from your experience, how has this been received, and what are people doing with it?
I think it's been received well, because of exactly the same reasons as you said yourself, Jane. Like, oh, that could have been my firm. That could have, yeah, that goes on, and there is in consulting at least this sort of sense of, and I think in law as well, this sense that nobody talks about this, but this is what happens, So there's this sense of sort of. A lot of the junior consultants, when I first arrived, thought I was going to do some, like expose or some scoop, like this is their real kind of the real deal. So I think it's being received well because of that degree of sort of face validity and recognition that you're talking about. To what are people doing with it? Well, it's still fairly early days, and the more particularly the point about leadership teams, you particularly in the context of a merger or a big change, but anything really, leadership teams, it's not just, a kind of make it go away day, or a kind of the woo-woo stuff. There's something actually about your effect on the kind of link from your dynamic to the organizational mood to the business performance. That is your money, your bonus, your profit, do you know what I mean? So I think that I drive that quite hard because to get their attention. There's another piece that I've done, and actually a different talk that I've given about wanted and unwanted roles in organizational ethnography. Because aside from the content, I realized, that I was cast in different ways, either as a spy or an invader, or as a sort of consigliere, or as a sort of like dumpster for unwanted emotions, or and I think that is also going well because people, whether you call it countertransference and the technical language, or whether you call it, lived experience or whatever, I think people really relate to the idea that in their system, the system that they're most familiar with, they end up taking up a role or a number of roles that they may or may not want to, that helps the system to function, but that actually may come at some cost to them.
That's really interesting, Peter. And that's also the parallel process of being a consultant as well, isn't it?
I think so. And being an internal consultant as well as an external consultant, definitely.
Fascinating. Thank you.
Pleasure.
We've got further questions from Alex and Liz, as well as a lovely suggestion from Antoinette to create a sacrificial anode support group.
Liz, could we hear from you? Because I know you've patiently been waiting. You've got a couple of comments/questions in the chat.
Sure, yeah. Firstly, Peter, thanks so much. Having been in a consultancy that is no more, I really identify with some of the things you've raised, and also other experience, other consultancies in an associate way. So I felt it was really, really insightful. I suppose what I was interested in is a couple of things. One was there seemed to be an assumption that kind of growth is good in the framing of this consultancy, and whether that was the consultant, whether that for you were seeing that you talked about a firm in decline or a firm in growth. And I suppose just a question about that. Is there another way of looking at the maturity of a consultancy? It isn't just about growth, but about the way they have the conversation, the way they do dialogue, the quality of their work and their practice as well. So I suppose that was just one thing. And I suppose the other was, about just by the virtue of you being there, and as we know, and you've kind of related to this already in the previous question, but just by being there, that you were influencing the system, and that some of the dynamics that you noticed, that was one of the contributing factors to that cycle of more confidence in the group and the collective leadership. I'm just curious about the impact of your presence there as part of that group moving into a more healthier place potentially.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much, Liz. So to your first point about growth, I think my only sort of thought was really that it's unrealistic to pursue commercial growth without developmental growth being sitting alongside that. Whether the pursuit of growth at the expense of the resources of the planet, the social fabric of and so that's a whole other question. And I did write a whole, informed by George Monbiot, I did write a whole kind of like tract about neoliberalism and consultancy, and about consultancy being politically informed, and it's a political choice, no such thing as neutrality, but it didn't make it to the final cut.
Shame. I'd love to see that.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think basically just read George Monbiot and you don't need to see it. So that's that point. And then your point about the effect on the system. I mean, I really struggled throughout, Liz, just on two fronts. One was, one of my supervisors at the beginning wanted me to do a kind of action research where I was going to intervene. And I thought, no, I've done that so often in my life. I just want to be a researcher for 18 months, whatever it turned out to be. But nonetheless, it was a constant push-pull. And, particularly if you feel like, the research host has done, well, if I felt like the research host, or they frame it in such a way that they're kind of doing me a favor, and that some degree of reciprocity is expected. How about the odd workshop? How about the odd intervention? How about the odd, even comment? And, it was really difficult at times to sit on my hands and go, yeah, if I was a consultant to you, I would do that, but I'm not a consultant to you. I'm a researcher. And I'm not saying I always succeeded, but I'm just saying I lived with that tension.
Okay, can I just follow up then? So did you reflect back? I mean, some of the stuff you shared here, I presume you've reflected that back to them as well, and they had a chance to have I mean, there's been conversations around that, which would be an intervention or not, or maybe not.
Oh, yes and no. I mean, I was pretty insistent that I disseminate my own findings to them first, because I didn't think it was morally right to tell anybody else about it before I told them. But it took me ages to get a slot at the partner meeting. It was on the back of some feedback from a pulse survey or an engagement survey or whatever. Yeah, Peter's, and I felt that, and I don't want to be unkind. I did get listened to, and I did get the respect I think the work deserved. And there was a bit of, yeah, but we're no longer like that, are we? Do you remember he was there then, and she was there then, and but we're not like that anymore. So it's a bit of. Sorry, you froze then, Liz.
It says something too, I suppose, isn't it? Sorry, just how they responded also says
It's
something.
data, isn't it?
Doesn't it?
Data, right? Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks, Peter.
It's a pleasure.
Peter, can I just share, you've just prompted a memory that a number of years ago, I did some work with a patent attorney, so professional services firm. And one of the things that really just struck me there was how things leaked. So we were working with the partner executive, but also things were not going well across the firm. So there were conversations with focus groups of more junior staff, including PAs. And it was a relatively, it wasn't a huge firm. I mean, big, medium-sized, but not, vast. And one of the things that was very interesting was that the partners were very clear that when they had their meetings, they might disagree behind closed doors and that they could have those conversations. But when they left, there was a collective, we've agreed on X, Y, or Z. What was really interesting was then in these focus groups, and particularly with the PAs, they knew exactly what had really gone on, because actually one of the things said, and obviously everybody was in the office, this was pre-hybrid working, pre-COVID. One of the PAs made the comment, oh yeah, I can always tell what he's thinking, because if it's not gone well, if he's not got his way, he slams his office door and won't speak to anyone for 2 hours.
Yeah.
So I wondered if there were sort of things around leakages that you had also seen in your researcher mode.
Yeah, very, very much so. And, I think that the cabinet responsibility that you're talking to was a struggle for the group that I worked with at all. They were very unlikely to surface the disagreement anyway, never mind sort of, unpack it, put it back together again and walk out with a shared view that they communicate. I mean, for a partner in a consulting firm or in a law firm, I think it's really, I observed that it's difficult for them to grasp the symbolic nature and what people read into their behavior. So they've got a cold, or they've had a shitty phone call, or something, and they stalk across the office And then, before you know it, the Madrid office is closing, the firm is going to be restructured. I mean, I'm being dramatic, but do you know what I mean? I think it's just super hard for them to step outside themselves and see how they might be seen. And I think not only leakage, as in sort of the rather more subtle what you're talking about, but actually it's worth saying that in a system where where people don't think that they can sort of speak their truth, that gossip and the rumor mill and character assassination and the subtle undermining of people and the sort of, look, I think Philippa is great, but there are some issues in the team. I've just picked it up on the wires, whatever, so it goes on and, trying to get to a point of candor was really too difficult for this group, I think.
Thanks, Peter. Alex, I think you had another question.
Yeah,
as well.
It was kind of an observation, really, and but firstly, thank you, Peter. It's been super fascinating and really relatable. So what always strikes me is that within these systems of partnerships and consulting firms is actually there's a sort of a very formal structure behind it all, which is how they're paid, and actually what an influence that is on their actions, their behaviors, etc., etc. And to me, that's very static. It's just, and it's very obvious to the outside world. And unlike other organizations, is that you don't have one chief executive, you've got a group of them, and the reward system kind of sets them apart. And actually how much influence and impact it has on the whole system and on individuals and teams and groups.
Yeah. Well, a partner did once tell me that that there's sort of several forms of anxiety that he experiences. One is task anxiety. I win work and then how am I going to get the resources, or I don't win work and what I described before. But also, and one of them he listed was financial anxiety. And it wasn't about sort of what I can accrue. The way he framed it was, can I live on my base salary? Because like not every, like many people, they're living up to the limits, whether it's, £100 a week or £1,000 a week or £10,000 a week, whatever, they're living up to the limit. So, this particular person, kids in school, all, all different sort of like, but he experienced that as considerable pressure. So when when the bonus is, bonus pool is divided and what have you, I suppose coming in, I just sort of, might have assumed that people are simply acquisitive, and but I got a little bit into the subjectivity of feeling quite trapped, and like rightly or wrongly, and whether it's privilege or we can talk about, but when you're at Frankfurt Airport and you've kind of lost your mojo and you're thinking, why am I even doing this? And I'm sort of trapped by my possessions, trapped by my situation. Often people would talk about the hamster wheel or the, being on autopilot or, and have I become, am I now the person that I want to be, so, yeah.
I mean, I don't know enough about it, but actually I don't ever seeing, that piece of this whole system really ever changing. I'm not sure that it's changed over many, many years. And if anybody would do or has got the courage to actually change the system or that piece of the system.
Well, I think there is the potential for change, not only the demographic changes that I was talking about in society that find their way eventually into the system, but also like AI is driving out a lot of the, potentially drives out a lot of the analytical tasks at the bottom of the pyramid. And, perhaps clients are less and less willing to pay big bucks for generic consulting. You know, they want you know, their definition of value is changing, and automation is changing things, and you know, geopolitics is changing things. And sometimes consultants have been able to take advantage of that because they kind of work on both sides of the economic cycle. But you know, I actually think consulting will look very different in 5 years' time, and I think the operating model of professional services firms, or at least the future operating model of professional service firms, is potentially very different to what it has been. Now, whether that drives other changes, you know, I don't know.
And Jane, you had a question, and we've got Edward with his hand up as well.
I think mine was very similar to Alex, just in terms of that noticing that actually the inherent structure of consulting is competitive. Although we talk collaboration, fundamentally it's competitive, consultant against consultant, and all the different hierarchies within that. So I'm just wondering about how that impacts organizational design.
And reward as well, because if the reward system says, you know, that your in-year profit is what we care about, but you're getting some kind of rhetoric about, hey, team up and win big, we're going for transformations, it's a long play, you know, don't worry if you invest in year 1 and it pays off in year 3, then what people experience is dissonance. You know, this is kind of schizoid. What am I supposed to do? And of course, what people default to is, I'd rather win 500k off you than be with 3 other partners in pursuit of 10 million that might not pay off in this year, because frankly, I might get the shove if you know, if it doesn't work out.
And so actually managing uncertainty is part of the anxiety as well.
For sure. Yeah, for sure.
Thank you.
Edward.
Yeah, I guess I'm kind of standing on the shoulders of giants of the conversation that's gone before, but it was just kind of interesting reflecting on, I mean, in Donald Trump's terms, which I'm just appalled that I'm even going to bring that up, but the deal, you know, so the kind of the model of consulting, which is the route to partner, or the route to future you know, kind of high profile or important or whatever jobs, of this is why people endure all the crap, and it's built on a kind of the model of differentiate, compete, and win. And actually that's only one model. You know, the example of even, you know, kind of this group here today, in terms of it's far more organic, it's far more built around shared purpose, and, you know, wanting to do good work. It's a different basis for action. And I think also with the changing societal and generational expectations of work, the deal becomes less and less palatable. And I'm wondering whether the kind of the reason that they didn't embrace your findings with open arms, Peter, was because you were challenging some underpinning assumptions about how they work and what winning looks like. There was an interesting conversation I was involved in on the weekend with Sue Campbell, who created or kind of generated the movement for women's football in the UK. And on the one hand, she was spoken to with one of the chairs of the football clubs or the federations, saying, whatever you do, don't embarrass us, which is just a fascinating reflection. And her view was that women's football was like a sapling that had grown up under or was failing to thrive under the massive oak tree in the canopy of men's football, and decided that actually she needed to move that sapling to where it had space and light to grow. So the kind of the mention of changing the system, sometimes you don't change the system, you offer a viable alternative.
I think that's really interesting. I mean, you know, a couple of thoughts from my side in response, Edward. One would be that I observed that the deal for junior consultants is compelling. For whatever I have said this morning, it's compelling. You get to work on some of the world's most interesting, thorny problems with some of the smartest people. You travel to very interesting client sites. You know, it can be very, very seductive and genuinely interesting. So anything that I'm sort of weighing in the balance is sort of like, there is another side to the story. It can be super compelling and super interesting. And, if one of our children said they want to be in consulting for, I would say that's a very interesting option. So I don't discount that. I think and one of the things I like about the firm I studied, I grew to like, is the appetite for action. Sometimes a ridiculous sort of premature action, but sometimes, just a kind of why not? Yeah, why not? Let's do that. Yeah, why not? Okay, let's just do it. Whereas, other clients and firms I've worked in myself would take ages to get to the same place. I think that, what we're talking about it takes time. It just takes time to change. It's not an intervention. It's not a sort of program. It's not, it just takes time. But probably what we're doing this morning is a contribution. But yeah, so those are, yeah, sorry, I've lost my thread a bit, but I think that's where I come from in response to what you said.
Just thinking, Peter, that yesterday I had a conversation with the new CPO, Chief People Officer of a health diagnostics company. And he was talking about some changes that the exec has gone through, and that they had become quite practiced in some reflective practice.
Mm.
And actually over the last couple of years, that's kind of gone away, it's dissipated again.
Oh.
And I'm just noticing that it's a sort of constant having to pay attention to it. It always makes me think, I don't quite know why, but when I had orthodontics when I was younger, and you know how you have the train tracks,
Yeah,
and then you have the band to kind of
Yeah.
keep your teeth where they are. But when you take that band off and are no longer wearing it every night, your teeth do move back a bit, and it's a bit like that with the top teams, and trying to pay attention to actually how they're working together. Unless it's a constant practice, it's very easy to get out of it and to slip back into the older ways of working. So I'm just thinking about the comment to you about, oh, so and so's left and X, Y, and Z isn't around anymore, and I know you weren't intervening in the system, but just how easy it is for even that conversation to happen, and how it has its own effect on, oh, it's okay, we don't need to bother with that anymore.
There's a bit of that, and in I agree, and that sort of gravitational pull to comfort really is very strong. At the same time, actually, just after I left, I heard, this isn't my research finding, but I heard this group had a very good COVID, if I can put it like that. I mean, COVID's terrible, and I got it, lots of people got it, many people died, it's awful. But they had it in as much as around a topic that was unfamiliar to them, that where there was no sort of like playbook, they were able to convene and offer a great deal of containment to their staff, and and behave in ways that they didn't seem able to under other conditions. So that was good, but sort of twice I feel, at least, they've missed an opportunity. I mean, I'm being a bit purist here, but they've missed an opportunity, because they could have, by some measure of reflective practice, they could have said, how did we behave in that downturn? Because there's going to be future downturns. How did we behave? What would we do again? What would we not do? Similarly, how did we behave in COVID? What would we, how has that strengthened us? How has it weakened us? So it's all that kind of reflective practice. And in the moment, that sort of, that kind of meta, not only creating thinking time, but thinking about how we typically think as a group. I always think about second order change, like we only know we've changed if we change the way we change, sort of thing. Anyway, I'm starting to rabbit now. Thank you. I agree.
I think we may have reached the end of our questions, which is actually great timing because we're coming towards the end of our time together. Andy, first of all, thank you very much for making sure that the conversation you had with Peter actually resulted in this pop-up happening. It's been a really fascinating conversation, as we've seen from the comments and from the discussion that's happened. And Peter, I definitely would agree that not only the content of your slides, but also those graphics. I was going, God, those are really good graphics, which just shows that we'll all now be looking to see where you got those graphics from. But we will, as ever, send out a recording of this this conversation that's happened. And I know, Andy, there was a request, I think, for the slides, and I wanted to know, Peter, whether you were happy to share the slides. Maybe have a mull on it. Won't put you on a. So you will have access to the slides in as much as they will be on this recording.
True. Yeah, true.
But Peter will have a mull about whether we actually put the slide deck on there.
Well, I mean, I don't really have an issue with sharing the slides. It's more, but in order not to be transactional, it would be great to have a follow-up conversation if that's appetite. And, you know, if part of that is sharing the slides and understanding a bit more about somebody else's context as well as blabbing about my own, that would be a much better outcome from my point of view.
Let's make that the deal then, okay? If that's the deal, or if you'd like a copy of the slides, perhaps contact us directly. Send it to hello@gameshift.co.uk, and then we can put you directly in touch. That might be another way of doing it. So, all that remains for me to say is thank you very much to everybody. And next month's pop-up is going to be on the 22nd of July, and actually it's going to be me and Chris Nichols. We very rarely appear on the pop-ups, but we decided that we would, because we are speaking later this month at a conference on open strategy, also known as participative strategy or collaborative strategy, i.e. the idea of involving people in coming up with ideas and thinking with wider groups than normally, whether it be about your strategic direction, transformation, or whatever. So we are presenting on the closed closets of open strategy. And so what we thought about on our pop-up is that we will talk a little bit about that and actually what you can do to open some of those closed closets. Slightly difficult to say, which I've now realised, having picked that as the title. But we'd very much like to see you there and your colleagues as well. As ever, these pop-ups are open to a very wide group, so do come along. So 22nd of July is our next pop-up. So in the meantime, just thank you again, Peter, and really lovely to see everybody. I know a number have had to go, and their thanks, Peter, to you. There've been a few thanks in the chat, so thank you very much.
The chat. Sorry, Philippa, do we get to have a look at the chat so that if there are questions that are
yes, the chat will be saved as part of the recording.
Great, thank you.
So really good to see everyone, and look forward to seeing you next time.
Thank you. It was a great session.
Bye, everyone.